Hello, I'm Bryant Wright, the president of Sin Relief, and it's my pleasure today to introduce two very important people to you that are engaged in ministries to refugees that Sin Relief is so heavily involved in. First of all, Philip Johnson, who is to my far left. He is an IMB church planner and leader of the Russian-Ukrainian ministry in West Germany, knowing that so many Ukrainian refugees have wound up in Germany with the war that has been going on there the last couple of years. And then Colby Garman, who is a Sin Network church planning catalyst and a teaching pastor at Pillar Church in Dumfries, Northern Virginia. Guys, we're glad to have you here today.
It's good to be here.
And Philip, I'd like to start out just ask you to share with our viewers today about the Ukrainian believers that have fled to Germany. How have you seen the Ukrainian Christians react to this crisis in a new surrounding there in West Germany?
Thank you, Brian, for this question. If I can describe the situation with the refugee crisis and how it all began, in the beginning I would probably describe that there was a time of confusion, time of desperation, time of complete shock, because no one could have even believed what would happen.
Yeah.
But then all these refugees that began coming to Europe, especially Germany, they were coming without absolutely nothing. And as they were coming to these countries, we were trying to mobilize our local churches that we are serving with to help these refugees. And in the beginning, there was just the idea to help these refugees with their basic human needs. To provide clothing, to provide food, medication, to take care of their children. And that was in the beginning of this whole crisis. And as the situation evolved, we began actually do what we as Christians were doing, providing them love with Christ and show them love of Christ.
Well, how have Ukrainians that are not Christian responded to seeing these acts of love on the part of your ministry there?
Among those that we were trying to help, of course, they were Christians and non-Christians, and regardless, we were helping all the Ukrainians who came to Germany and to Europe, providing them food with everything what they needed. And as they were coming, they were wondering why in the world people are so open to help them. Yeah. And it was the best time for us to tell them that we as Christians, we just want to extend to show them love of Christ. It was the main thing to answer their needs, but at the same time to tell them we're not the ones. God is taking care of them through people. And they were truly, truly shocked that we as a simple people, with German Christians and European Christians helping people that were in need.
Well, I really believe that the kind of ministry you're doing, Philip, there is what I call winning the right to be heard. We're living out Christ's great commandment of loving God and loving our neighbors ourselves. But in the process of doing that, we win the right to be heard because people start asking questions. Why are you doing this? And then it makes them open to the gospel, which is why I feel like you can't separate the great commandment and the great commission. They go hand in hand if we're going to fulfill Christ's mission for the church. You shared earlier about a lady that came to Christ. Could you tell our viewers about that story? That's exciting.
Yes. At our home, my wife Galina and I, we organized what we call Feeding Point, feeding ministry. And basically people from the process centers, refugee centers were coming to us, to our apartment, and we were feeding them. And day after day, we would be crying with them, listening to their stories. And there was a family of three, a lady and two of her children that were coming every day just to be there, just to receive food. And as they were coming, that lady, her name is Irina, she began talking to my wife. And one of the questions was, why are you taking care of us? Why you're so open? And Galina began asking her story, and Irina began sharing. And little by little, Galina told Irina about love of Christ, that God loves us even more so because God cares about our spiritual needs. And Galina was able to witness to her, and a few days later, she prayed, received Christ.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. Wow. Amen.
And really, that is meeting the ultimate need in any person's life is to come to have that saving relationship with Christ. And you told us that she was then excited about being a disciple, reaching her own daughter for Christ, which was pretty exciting to hear.
Exactly. Well, she was after received Christ, she brought next day her older daughter,
That's
and
great.
she reached immediately Galina. She said, "Galina, would you share with me what you share with her, what you shared with me yesterday? Because I want my daughter to hear about God, about Jesus, what you told me, because I want him to love her too." And Galina shared with her daughter, and the daughter prayed to receive Christ.
That's awesome. You know, really, true disciples make disciples. So for her immediately
That's right.
to have that excitement about doing that, that's wonderful. Well, Colby, his church, Pillar Church, has been ministering with a focus on Afghan refugees. And as we know, when the Taliban retook Afghanistan and that devastating exit of American troops and a lot of personnel, a lot of Afghan people there, it thrust Afghans here into the United States all over the country, but especially where you all are. So could you tell folks a little bit about how you became engaged in that ministry?
Yeah, in August of 21, when that refugee crisis began, for us, there's a lot of things that happen in the world that we don't necessarily get involved in.
Yeah.
But this one hit close to home for our church for two particular reasons. One of those reasons was our church is 50% Marines, active duty. Many of them not only served in Afghanistan, but currently some of the folks who are involved in the airlift are members of our church.
Yeah.
And they had worked alongside Afghans, many who had lost their fathers, to Taliban violence.
Yeah.
And knew that folks were not safe, and they cared about the people coming out in a really unique way.
Yeah.
But they were also coming to Quantico as an initial place, and so right there, in our backyard, we saw that there was going to be a need, and we felt like because it was in our backyard, it was our responsibility to lead other Southern Baptists to be able to be engaged in caring for those refugees.
And while you're sharing that, Colby, I know that initially so many Afghan refugees did start at the military bases.
That's
Is
right.
there a possibility that there's still many there, that churches who have military bases nearby would still have Afghans there, or have they already scattered pretty
No,
much?
they pretty quickly, within 4 or 5 months, wanted to get the refugees off of the bases and out into the community. And they did
see.
that by really early in 2022. But that meant, in a second phase of work and effort on our part was connecting with them in the community.
Yeah.
And for us, we started something called Nations to Neighbors that really was reflective of our heart, to not just see them as people coming from other nations, but to love them as our neighbors,
Yeah,
and to apply the
absolutely.
Great Commandment to this situation.
Well, God has brought new neighbors in our midst,
Yeah.
with refugees from all kind of nations around the world, but y'all specifically dealing with Afghan refugees. Could you help our viewers, though, have a better idea of how they individually and as churches could reach out in connecting to Muslim refugees, just knowing that there's a hard heart with a lot of
Yeah.
Muslims concerning any openness to Christianity. So what have y'all learned that would be helpful to other churches that begin to reach out to Muslim refugees?
Yeah, just like anyone that's new into a community or crossing culture, there are some basic needs that are there. And the first one is often language. Even if one person in the family speaks serviceable English, most of the others who are in their household don't.
Yeah.
And being able to offer ESL classes, having trained volunteers who can just really do relational conversational ESL. They don't have to be experts.
Yeah.
They just have to be able to speak English and walk through it. And we often do that using American holidays and Bible stories that allow us opportunities to share our experiences and to get to gospel conversations. But that's a really simple way. It's a huge need. The other thing we found was not only were we able to offer some financial support to buy groceries, but we asked our people to go to the grocery store with families to help them navigate that new experience. And even still today, there are families going to the grocery store with some of the refugees in our community, and they've built friendships just along the lines of helping them learn to shop locally.
So when Johnson Ferry a few years ago was having a very intentional ministry with Syrian refugees, also Muslims, the stories that our volunteers from Johnson Ferry told us about taking them to the American grocery stores
Yeah.
was really kind of comical, because they were so overwhelmed
Yeah.
with all the choices that they had never had before, that almost paralyzed them. Just not. They were very thankful,
Yeah.
but they just couldn't hardly make a decision with
right.
all the things. So I don't know whether y'all found some of that.
Yeah, I had a personal experience. One day it was my day off, and Trey Salter from
With
Send
Send
Relief
Relief,
called
yeah.
me because he had a contact with somebody who just moved into our community. And I said, well, I'm probably the only person available. And I thought, I'll just go meet this guy and find out what's going on. And so before you know it, we were at the grocery store that afternoon and just watching them try to figure that out. The powerful thing was, they were confused, but that moment of human need is such a connection.
It is. It really is.
And we became, friends and close. I've been in their house
Yeah.
a lot over the last year and a half to be able to minister to them. But that was the starting point, and just in that comedy of some of that, it lets barriers down. They experienced the love of God as we were serving them in that moment because we understood what they were going through. Yeah.
And I think it's also very convicting for us as Americans when we realize how overwhelmed they are. I mean, we chuckled about the experiences, about how they were responding, but at the same time, we all got convicted about how much we have here and take for granted of what we have here, and they just could not believe.
Yeah, and I served with the IMB overseas, and I could remember that moment of going into a grocery store not being able to read anything. And so being able to connect with that experience, I think just really allowed those connections to be made.
And I hope our listeners will realize that what Colby's saying is whether your church has 15 people or 4,000 people,
right.
there are people in any church that can reach out to a refugee and help them learn how to go to a grocery store here in America. I mean, it's
That's
something
right.
anybody can do in these everyday experiences.
We always have had a mindset, we may not be able to do everything, but it can be meaningful for that family.
Absolutely.
We can do something. And so our church is just a medium-sized church, 250, 300 people, and we just tried to individually attach to families we could walk with over 6-8 months
That's right.
to help them get
And
settled.
speaking of your church, how do you feel, and this would help our viewers today to think about how an experience like this of ministering to refugees, how it's impacted your local church?
Yeah. What it's done is it's taken up issue that's a political hot button, where a lot of our folks, as they're navigating the immigration challenges that we're experiencing politically here in the country, they don't know what to think.
Yeah.
And it's put actually a real face and real human experience into it, where now they're seeing it from a different light. They're seeing what possibly God is doing and bringing people from all over the world to a
That's
country
right.
where they can hear the gospel freely. And it becomes not just a political issue that is mediated in talking points on a TV show or a news show, to being about real people in our community, friends that they've made, and hurting people who've lost family members and are just trying to make a life here.
That's right.
And when we show up in those moments and we see them as real people who are created in the image of God, we get an opportunity to complete that story by sharing the gospel with them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It really is. Well, I can't say how. It's just no way to overestimate the impact of ministering to refugees at Johnson Ferry Baptist, where I pastored before I retired from there, the impact it had on our local church and individual members, and also the faces. As you talked about the faces, there's a lot of jargon out there with all the challenges of immigration, but here's something I really encourage the viewers to recognize. There is a role of government when it comes to immigrants and refugees.
Yeah.
They have the responsibility of deciding who comes in and who cannot. They have the responsibility of upholding the immigration laws, and we know what a failure our immigration laws have been in recent history. But the church has a different role. The church has the opportunity to show the love of Christ and to treat our neighbors as if they are Jesus, because Jesus does say in his great parable on the judgment in Matthew 25 of the separation of sheep and goats, he said, look, how you treat the hungry, how you treat the homeless, how you treat refugees, immigrants. They're called strangers in your New Testament. How you treat them is how we treat Jesus.
That's right.
And I think we have to have that attitude, realizing the role of the church is different from the role of government. And we have to decide if we're going to let the Word of God and the teaching of Jesus be our authority, or our tribal news feed, or our tribal political ideology. If they come before Jesus and the Word, then we've got our priorities backwards. So that's a key for us. One quick thing, because I know we have limited time here. Philip, but is there any recommendations you would have for how to pray for Ukrainians, not only refugees in Europe, but that are still in the Ukraine now? Because that war's been going on now for a long time.
I think the best prayer, the best idea for the prayer for Ukrainian refugees is that right now among Ukrainians there is a growing inside movement, and those Ukrainian refugees that are in Europe, they are saying we are no longer scared refugees, we are active missionaries. And
That's beautiful.
we
That's
just
great.
pray that the Lord will continue to support this movement, because those Ukrainians, they are reaching their own people that are refugees in
That's
Europe and
beautiful.
Germany and other countries.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we need to pray for those that are left behind in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So because these people are organizing help back to the Ukraine, those that are left behind. So
love that.
pray for this great missionary movement that God has created out of this entire crisis. Ukrainian missionary movement.
Well, Phillips, that's another example of God bringing good out of a bad situation,
That's
from
true.
refugee to missionary. And as you talk, Colby, Afghans that are coming here that we would have never had access to
That's
share
right.
the gospel. It really is amazing. So for all of our viewers and listeners, we thank you for giving us a few minutes to share about how we can have a more Christ-centered ministry to refugees.